and welcome to today's lecture on the latter half of the New Kingdom. I'm your professor, Dr. Ramses II, and today we're going to find out what happens in the aftermath of a pharaoh trying to rewrite everything about Egyptian art, culture, and religion. Now, we've seen that in much of Egyptian history, a disruption like that of Akhenaten's heresy might lead all of Egypt into a period of fragmentation, weak royal rule, and invasion from the outside. But miraculously, for the New Kingdom Egyptians, this ends up just being a short blip on a soaring trajectory. And that's due, at least in part, to the famous King Tutankhamun. So whether you like King Tut for restoring Egyptian religion, or just appreciate his golden burial mask, journey with me as we investigate the New Kingdom's 19th dynasty.
The New Kingdom was prospering at an unprecedented level. Thutmose III was leading expeditions all the way up into Mesopotamia, and Hatshepsut was leading expeditions all the way down into Punt. Egypt was wealthy, building massive temples and thriving in every way. And then Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, proclaimed the Aten or sun disk as the primary deity of Egypt, and moved the capital city to Akhetaten, or Amarna, in the middle of nowhere. Talk about a serious disruption to the natural order of things.
We all know about King Tut for his incredible tomb, discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter. The only royal tomb in Egypt ever to be found unlooted. His sarcophagus and burial mask have become iconic, and the riches of the tomb are a testament to the wealth of the pharaohs. I mean, he was a relatively short-lived king. He died young. He was crippled in some ways, and his tomb held an incredible array of art, artifacts, jewelry, furniture, and just about everything one might need for the afterlife.
King Tut, or Tutankhamun to use his full name, was important historically despite his short-lived reign. He was the son of the heretic king Akhenaten, and it fell to him to deal with the fallout of his father's religious and cultural changes. He moved the capital back to Memphis, former capital of the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. He restored the damage done by Akhenaten to the Temple of Amun at Karnak, and he set about to restore the political alliances and hegemony with foreign powers that existed prior to Akhenaten's rule. We can see the results of those foreign relations in the exotic grave goods found in King Tut's tomb.
King Tut started ruling when he was a mere 9 years old, pretty young, and he ruled for about 10 years. And during his life, he had all sorts of health problems. The product of the common practice of incestuous brother-sister marriage for royal families in Egypt. So for example, he had a cleft palate and scoliosis, and he had a clubbed foot, and at some point in time he got malaria. So even though he ruled for 10 years by the time he was your age, he also went through some pretty bad stuff as well. Now the cause of his death is still a mystery, but hopefully he went out knowing that he'd set Egypt back on a path to prosperity.
The 19th dynasty resumed the prosperity, expansion, and empire that began with the rulers of the 18th dynasty, The best known ruler of the 19th dynasty, and perhaps all of Egyptian history, was the mighty Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. Ramses' rule began in 1279 BCE and lasted all the way until 1213 BCE, an incredible reign of 66 years. During this time, he took over 200 wives and concubines, producing a whopping 96 sons and 60 daughters, most of whom he outlived. With all that time between those Egyptian cotton sheets, it's amazing he had any time at all for all the conquering he did.
But Ramses the Great certainly did have time for some good old-fashioned conquering. Ramses is best known for his campaigns in Syria, but his first campaign was on the Egyptian home soil against a naval group known as the Sheridan, part of the infamous Sea Peoples. Ramses says that he lured these naval pirates into the Nile Delta with a small contingent of ships. And then he sprung a surprise attack from both sides, sinking his opponent and securing his first victory. But the Sea Peoples would eventually return 100 years later when Ramses III was ruling Egypt. And next time, they wouldn't be thwarted so easily.
Ramses' next campaign was in the south in Nubia. He was still young, only 22 at the time, and he took his own young children with him for their first battle campaign. Ramses brags on the wall of one of his temples that he had to fight one battle against the Nubians all by himself. Ramses' greatest military accomplishments, however, came in Syria against the Hittites, and we'll take a closer look at that in just a minute.
Probably the only thing Ramses II liked more than conquering was building. He probably built more than any other pharaoh, either before or since his rule. Ramses made substantial renovations at Karnak and at Luxor. And he also built a temple to himself, known as the Ramesseum, which is incredibly well preserved and tells his story of his victory over the Hittites at the Battle of Kedesh. More on that soon. Further south, he built a great temple at Abu Simbel, a temple to put him on the same divine level as the other gods of Egypt. Oh, and he also founded a completely new capital city called Pi-Ramesses, named after himself, of course, in the north and lower Egypt.
Ramses' greatest battles came against the Hittite Empire. The Hittites were another Bronze Age empire, and their homeland was in central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And just while Egypt was expanding north under Ramses II, the Hittites were expanding south under their own king, Muwatalli II. Eventually, the two empires came to clash at the site of Kedesh, near the border of Lebanon and Syria. It took place in 1274 BCE, and it's incredibly important historically. Not necessarily because of the outcome, but because it's the first ever battle for which we have a detailed step-by-step progression accompanied by battle formations.
So Kedesh itself is right on the border between the two empires. Sometimes the Egyptians held sway over it, sometimes it was ruled by the Hittites. But in the spring of 1274 BCE, Ramses led his army out of the Nile Delta, north and east, towards Kedesh. Ramses' army was divided into 4 cohorts, each named after one of the major Egyptian gods. So there was the cohort of Amun, and Ra, and Set, and Ptah. Chariots formed the most powerful part of the army, with each cohort having at least 500 chariots.
Ramses marched confidently on the city, and 2 captured Hittites told him that the Hittite army was still more than 100 miles away. But the prisoners turned out to be spies for the Hittites, who were really hiding their entire army right behind the city. As Ramses obliviously continued his march, the Hittites, led by their own chariots, sprung the trap. They charged relentlessly into the broadside of Ramses' infantry lines, causing chaos to ensue.
Now, Ramses takes credit for driving the Hittites back all by himself. But sources suggest that what really turned the tide was the cohort system of the Egyptians. The Hittites had thought that they defeated the entire army, and they started to plunder the Egyptian camp. They stopped fighting and started plundering. But in the midst of their plundering, the next infantry and chariot cohort of Egyptians showed up to drive them back and put an end to their advance. The Battle of Kedesh is famous and important for another reason as well. We actually have the accounts from both sides of the battle. This is really cool. So we have the Egyptian account from Ramses II about what happened, and we have the Hittite account from Muwatalli II about what happened. And we also have the freaking peace treaty. Very, very cool. I'm not going to spoil what that says though. You'll just have to read it and find out for yourself.
It should come as no surprise that Ramses the Great needed to bury dozens of children who died before him, and he was successful enough to have the money to do it. By the New Kingdom, however, burial practices had changed significantly. Pharaohs had learned the giant pyramids looked pretty cool, but they were also like giant flashing beacons screaming, "Loot me, I'm full of riches!" To combat this, New Kingdom pharaohs built elaborate funerary temples, like that of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri. But they moved their actual tombs underground, in a place known as the Valley of the Kings. The goal was to protect the pharaohs from being disturbed in their afterlife.
The Valley of the Kings is located on the western banks of the Nile. Like all burial sites, it's set to the west to represent the setting of the sun. Moreover, some scholars have argued that the site itself was chosen because of the rocky outcrop at the top of the valley, which somewhat resembles a natural pyramid. And we kind of see that over here, providing the primordial mound symbolism for everyone buried within the tombs of the valley. Over the course of several hundred years, 63 rock-cut tombs were constructed in the Valley of the Kings, ranging from basic pits to massive, elaborate works.
The largest of these tombs, known as KV5, was for the sons of Ramses II and contained over 130 rock-cut chambers. Amazingly, no one knew the extent of the tomb until the middle of the 1990s. Previous archaeologists, 100 years ago, including Howard Carter, knew about the tomb itself, and they dug the first few chambers. They saw it was looted, and they never bothered to go any deeper. Then, in 1995, the tomb began to be cleared for a mapping project. And lo and behold, more than 70 new chambers were found, roughly correlating to the number of sons Ramses the Great had.
The discovery of KV5 was the greatest discovery in the Valley of the Kings since Howard Carter unearthed the tomb of King Tut, which was known as KV62 in 1922. This is famous, of course, because it's the only royal burial not to have been looted in antiquity. I guess the idea of hiding royal burials underground didn't really work that much better than hiding them in giant pyramids. Anyway, more than 5,000 objects were found in the tomb, including a gold coffin and a golden burial mask, in addition to jewelry, furniture, weapons, a throne, and much, much more.
While the 19th dynasty was strong and expansive, the 20th dynasty, the last of the New Kingdom, grew weaker and became defensive. This is perhaps best exemplified by Ramses III, the second king of the 20th dynasty. As we'll see, Egypt was by no means impoverished at this time. Ramses III's temple at Medinet Habu attests to its continued wealth. But it certainly had taken a step back in terms of its military might. Egypt wasn't going out to fight enemies anymore. The enemies were coming into Egypt.
Ramses III began to rule at the beginning of the 12th century BCE. This period in time, known as the end of the Bronze Age, saw the widespread collapse of previously thriving civilizations. The Hittites of Anatolia fell. The Minoans of Crete collapsed. The mighty Mycenaeans of mainland Greece were destroyed. And Egypt was no exception to the destruction that crossed the Mediterranean during this period of time.
That explanation involved the Sea Peoples. In year 8 of Ramses III's reign, he records more than a half dozen different groups attacked Egypt, both by land and by sea. Ramses names these people, and modern scholars have attempted to match them up with known populations. The Peliset were perhaps the Philistines. The Denyen were perhaps the Greek Danaoi. The Sheridan, perhaps the Sardinians, and the Shekelesh, perhaps Sicilians. We'll likely never know whether those attributions are indeed accurate. But if so, it gives a sense of just how crazy the 12th century Mediterranean must have been. Pirates coming around from everywhere.
While the battles were tough, Ramses III recorded that he defeated the Sea Peoples, even settling some of them in Canaan. Which actually might explain the rise of the Philistines there shortly afterwards. Remember that the Peliset in Egyptian were one of the groups of the Sea Peoples, and we think that might correspond to the word Philistines. These records he recorded on the walls of his funerary temple at Medinet Habu, providing some of the only written historical evidence that might explain the widespread collapse at the end of the Bronze Age. Now, modern scholars argue for more complex explanations, taking into account environmental factors and internal rebellion as well. But most still agree that invasions and marauding likely played a significant role in the collapse of the Bronze Age and the wars in Egypt. The ability of the 19th dynasty Egyptians to recover from Akhenaten's heresy is truly impressive. They don't just survive, they thrive. Ramses the Great is the next in a line of great Egyptian pharaohs, conquering lands far and wide and bringing economic prosperity to his own land in Egypt. There in Egypt, a broader range of people are getting access to a great afterlife, and the Book of the Dead is proliferating amongst those wealthy enough to be buried with it. For royalty, they've become smart enough to bury themselves in hidden chambers underground, rather than in giant pyramids with neon signs that say, "Come loot me, I'm full of gold." Once again, however, it was not to last. And while we don't see the end of the new kingdom in Egypt quite yet, the fraught reign of Ramses III and the invasion of the Sea Peoples suggest that trouble is on the horizon. Just a few lessons you can learn from the European Dynasties.